Thank you. And for quite a few years, I've been hoping to attend Cape conferences, so I'll thank Ed for continuing to invite me, despite previous failures, and I'm quite happy that I finally made it, and have enjoyed the morning and looking forward to the afternoon. In part answer to a question that Jesse raised, my starting position here is that private flows are motivated by profit, and they may contribute to economic development. Whereas aid and public flows, or public finance, should be motivated by social returns. And they are and will continue to be essential for human development. And I'm focusing on the latter, on aid and the kind of relationship between aid and donors and domestic revenue, in particular tax. I'll also say that most of my comments are motivated by evidence and experience for sub-Saharan Africa. Most of the points are relevant to other developing countries, but the issues may change slightly in different places. First, just a very brief primer on mobilizing domestic revenue. What are you actually talking about? It can be easy to lose sight of fundamentals when you're talking about lofty goals like sustainable development goals. And the underlying thing or issue is that tax performance, or the tax GDP ratio, it's determined by structural factors of the country. There are the economic structure and the nature of the economy determines the tax base to which the tax rates are applied. So that's fundamentally what's determining the potential for domestic tax revenue. Most of the tax policy reforms that have been implemented are often concerned with tax rates or with measures to improve administration and collection efficiency. And I think Kieran will be saying a lot more about those issues. And of course, they include capturing the tax base. But the reforms themselves aren't really about the tax base. And the changes in the tax base are determined largely by economic performance. And some bases, such as trade, incomes, consumption spending, are easier to tax than others, such as corporations, multinationals, and resources. And that's as true in developing countries as we now know it is in developed countries. And that's very important for a number of reasons. One issue is that we know that resource revenues are often, if not always, less transparent than other types of tax revenues, and they're also frequently more volatile, because typically resource tax revenues will be related to, if not linked to, the world price of the particular resource, and we know that world commodity prices are volatile. So the problem with resource taxes is often a lack of transparency and an inherent volatility. The more fundamental problem is that you've had that the observed growths in GDP have not, in general, been matched by a growth in the tax base. Partly that's because, well, the most extreme examples will be countries like Ghana and Nigeria that relatively recently rebased GDP. So suddenly there was an appearance of dramatic growth because they had said, oh, we weren't counting the subsistence or informal sector correctly. So you had a sudden increase in GDP because they rebased it, but there was no corresponding increase in tax GDP. So actually the statistics would show a reduction in the tax GDP ratio. But that wasn't due to tax effort, that was because they changed the denominator. And resources can have similar types of effects, because suddenly if you discover a resource, there can be a large accounting increase in, say, export revenue or something that's not going to be matched by taxation. So you have to understand that there's a distinction between what's happening to the tax base and what's happening to GDP. And of course, GDP is fundamental if you're looking at the tax to GDP ratio. The other problem in many of the African countries is that the tax bases that have been growing are the ones that are most difficult to tax. Resources, multinationals, and the kind of very wealthy or high net wealth individuals or whatever you call them. That's where a lot of the growth has been, but they're the hard to tax areas. Whereas the easier to tax areas, like formal sector employment and earnings, which would be the income tax base, and private spending, the consumption tax base, they're not growing at the same rate at all. In fact, formal sector employment is fairly stagnant in most of these countries. A similar problem is emerging in the UK. That it's not just employment, it's employment with adequate earnings to be a taxpayer. It's still the case that throughout sub-Saharan Africa, the formal sector employment is rarely more than 20% of the labour force. And many of those are in the public sector. So that's the fundamental problem, is that if you're going to increase the tax to GDP ratio, you need to be able to increase the fundamental tax base. And that really is employment and incomes of the population. And it's the failure for that type of growth underpins the challenge in increasing the tax to GDP ratio. Now, a little bit about donors and what's their role. And first, a brief comment that there is a literature, it's beloved in economics to run cross-country growth regressions. So you collect data on the aid to a country, or in particular the share of aid that's grants, and you collect data on the tax GDP ratio of that country, and you run regressions to see if there's a pattern. And it's fairly easy to find that, well, yes, there's a negative pattern, a negative relationship, that countries with lower tax to GDP ratios tend to get more aid, and more of their aid is in the form of grants. But the main reason for that is that the underlying structural characteristics that lead to a low to tax GDP ratio are also the same characteristics that lead to a low income, which are the same characteristics that attract more aid in the form of grants. Once you allow for this, for the fact that both aid and tax revenue are underlying determined by characteristics of the economy, once you allow for that, you can make these significant effects disappear. So overall, there is no robust or convincing evidence that there's any link between the amount of aid, or the amount of aid in the form of grants, and tax GDP. It varies across countries. In some cases, it might be positive. In some cases, it might be negative, but there's no general relationship. But that doesn't mean that donors don't influence policy options and policy choices that then have an effect on taxation. Because donor-driven or supported policies, often associated with aid, do have effects on tax rates and do have effects on tax systems and do have effects on the tax base. Some of the reforms reduce tax rates. So in many African countries from the 1980s through until even more recently, a common reform has been trade liberalization, which essentially involves eliminating export taxes, reducing tariffs on imports, so reducing trade taxes, and that's often led to a reduction in overall tax revenue because low-income countries typically rely heavily on trade taxes because trade is easy to tax, or relatively easy to tax. Now, those revenue losses may be short-term, but it's just that some of the policies associated with donors have reduced certain tax rates and certain tax revenues. Other reforms have improved tax systems. You've had the introduction of VAT, the semi-autonomous revenue authorities that Kieran knows far more than I do about, many reforms to administration, public financial management, MTEFs, all of these over at least 15 years, there have been significant donor-supported efforts to improve the functioning of the tax system. Broadly speaking, I think the current evidence for sub-Saharan Africa, at least, is that the the introduction of value-added tax has not evidently been associated with any increase in total tax revenues. Possibly the main reason for that is that often value-added tax was implemented or associated with a period where trade taxes were being reduced. So instead of taxing goods when they came into the country at the border, they were taxed in the country at value-added tax, often collected at the border, of course. So the value-added tax often just substituted for reduction in trade taxes. The autonomous revenue authorities, they do seem to have been associated with increases in total revenue. There's some evidence that there's an initial increase, a kind of a jump effect, but then it levels out again. So they don't generate a sustainable or permanent increase in the growth of tax revenue, but they do generate an increase in the level of tax to GDP. So the ultimate effective aid is going to be that effective aid and kind of effective economic reforms that increase the tax base, and in particular employment and incomes, are important and are essential for increasing the tax to GDP ratio over time. But it's a slow process. It's also worth observing here that the multiplicity of donors and instruments is part of the problem. Where recipient governments have to deal with an increasing number of donors using a variety of aid instruments with different accounting requirements, different monitoring requirements, that weakens the recipient's ability to monitor what it's actually getting in terms of aid, and undermines its ability to incorporate aid funding within its fiscal planning. So the kind of multiplicity of donors is part of the problem. It makes fiscal planning very difficult, or more difficult, in these countries. And I'll come back to that in the final issue. Now, because it was raised this morning, and because I know it'll come up again later, it's useful to say a little bit about the corruption challenge. And really the comment I want to make here is to think of corruption in more of a comparative manner. In the point that it's money attracts the corrupt. And aid is one source of money in the economy that will attract corrupt behavior. But its tax revenue is another form of money that will attract this behavior. Government expenditure will attract it. Private flows and foreign direct investment will also attract corrupt behavior. So the important question to ask is not, does aid support corruption, or does aid make corruption worse? The important question to ask is aid more susceptible to corruption than other types of financing flows? And I think there are good reasons to argue that it isn't. That in fact, aid is probably the least susceptible to corruption. And this is because it's the most carefully monitored. It's by no means perfect, but it's probably better than the other alternatives, because the donors are conscious and they are trying to monitor how their aid is used. So those officials or politicians that want to engage in corrupt behavior, they know that. They know that these flows are more carefully monitored. So they're not the easy pickings. The easy pickings are some of the other flows. One of those is the tax and expenditure system. Again, to the extent that aid-funded projects and donor support has improved administration, that has improved monitoring of the fiscal system, so it may be less susceptible to corruption than it was in the past. And I won't say any more on this because I know that it's coming up later. And I think I'd emphasize that perhaps natural resources are actually the most suspect or susceptible to corrupt behavior. The lack of transparency, the potential for hiding flows and hiding revenues means that they're very attractive for corrupt behavior. And as a consequence, foreign direct investment and multinationals are more likely to be part of the problem than part of the solution. If anybody's making things worse, it's probably them. Contrary to, there was a reference this morning to Moyo's book. Well, that's something that she seemed to completely ignore, but that's because the book was totally unencumbered by any evidence. So, corruption, yes, it is a problem, but it's a problem because, worldwide, politicians tend to be venal. And if there are opportunities for them to get incentives, it might be called contributions to political parties in some countries, it might be called corruption in others, this type of behavior happens. And it certainly affects any types of flows or investments, and in particular the tax system. Because bottom line is nobody likes paying taxes. Shocker. So a final, just a couple of comments on where is external finance or aid funding particularly suitable? Given that there has to be we all want to see an increase in domestic revenue, but that's going to be a slow process unless the tax base significantly increases at a rate in line with GDP. But there will continue to be a need for aid or international public finance, and there are certain areas where it is particularly useful and particularly appropriate. And perhaps the most convincing of those is where there are regional spillovers. Health is a prime example. The Ebola crisis is a prime example of that. We know that regional spillovers are a major problem. We know that the problem is too difficult for domestic health spending to cover, so it's an obvious case for international aid, yet there's surprisingly little of it. Environment is another, which is well recognized and provides some links to the Sustainable Development Goals. They're obvious areas where international public finance is important. Another area where it can be very important is kind of reforms that are very costly initially and/or generate revenue losses initially. So trade liberalization, where you're reducing trade taxes, can be a situation that you provide aid temporarily to help them compensate for the loss of revenue whilst they substitute taxes to regain the lost revenue. Interventions or projects in education are another example. Moving to universal primary education is a very good idea, but it's expensive. And of course, after you've achieved universal primary education, then you've lots more students that are able to go on to secondary education, which becomes more important. And like Uganda, you start aspiring to universal secondary education. That's expensive. They're areas where international finance can help with the high initial costs, because they're not going to generate returns very quickly, and they're not going to generate tax revenue for quite a while. The same is true with safe water, sanitation, all of these types of things. So it's what we'd call social or public goods. They require international public finance. And there'll be other areas where targeted interventions, especially in healthcare, that can be very suitable. But the final bit to kind of mention is that how should the public finance be delivered? Or how should the aid be delivered? Now, where it's a case of the kind of regional public goods, then that's quite suitable for a multilateral agency or particular agencies to coordinate. Where it's particular projects, again, that can be quite suitable for donor projects or agency projects. But in the basic financing of government social sector spending, I'm certainly a believer that budget support is the best way. partly because, as I said earlier, the multiplicity of donors and instruments creates more problems or creates new problems and difficulties. And it's quite evident that budget support is effective once the donors and the recipients are in broad agreement of how the money should be allocated. And as long as monitoring systems are in place, that will be effective. So, to conclude, it's true that aid is no longer the largest component of, it's no longer the largest component of potential development finance, but aid and tax is going to remain the major source of funding for human development in low-income countries.
Thank you very much indeed, Oliver.